Hi, everybody. It's Jay, and I am back in the booth with you for another sneak peek video preview for this week's new release here on Say with Jay. This week, our new release is A Cowboy's Gentle Touch. It's the fifth book in Jessie Gussman's Sweet View Ranch Western Sweet Romance series, and I've got more about the story and a live preview reading for you in just a bit. But first, as Jessie has been doing for a while now, she's been including recipes in her story, and I've been making them for you here. We're going to do that again today in another segment we like to call Cooking with Jay. This week, we're going to be making Mississippi pot roast. And it's super quick and super easy, and so super quick and so super easy that I need something else to talk about. And honestly, this is a great example of something that I think about all the time. And that is the Mandela effect. Don't know if you've ever heard of it or not. And in fact, I had this weird feeling of deja vu that maybe I've even talked about it in a preview before. Feel free to go back and look at all the previews to find it if you want. But the Mandela effect, what that is when we, as a collective society, or lots of people within it, remember some event, or we think we remember something, but we truly didn't. It's named after Nelson Mandela, the human rights activist who fought the apartheid policies of South Africa, and many people remember him dying in prison in the 1980s. It didn't happen, mostly because he actually became the president of South Africa in a post-apartheid time, and he didn't die until 2013. But that's a good example of things we just think we remember for whatever reason. Another interesting one to me, many of you might play the game Monopoly. And you might remember the mascot of the game, the little man who's in the center of the board, I think, and who is on the community chest and chance cards, whose name is Uncle Pennybags. Lots of us remember Uncle Pennybags dressed in his morning suit and top hat and monocle. Except he never wore a monocle. Go back, pull out your Monopoly set if you don't believe me, and look, and you'll never see him with a monocle. Most likely, people are conflating our memories with that of the Planters Peanut Company mascot, Mr. Peanut, who does indeed wear a top hat and a monocle. Another one that's fairly well known is from the movie Casablanca. If you're of a certain age, Casablanca represents one of the more romantic movies ever made, between Humphrey Bogart, a romance between Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. And it's famous for, among other things, the line, "Play it again, Sam." Except that was never said. Sam, the piano player at Humphrey Bogart's club in Casablanca, is asked by Ingrid Bergman to play it once, Sam, for old time's sake. That's as close as we get to "Play it again, Sam." They both at one point in the movie say, "Play it, Sam," or "play it," but "Play it again, Sam" is never spoken. One which I will fight you to this day about, even though I know I'm wrong, I know I've been proven wrong, but many of us of a certain age might remember the television commercials of the Publishers Clearinghouse giveaways. You remember the commercials where Ed McMahon comes to your door with a ridiculously giant check for your winnings in the sweepstakes. Only that's not really the way it happened, because Ed McMahon never worked for Publishers Clearinghouse. He actually promoted American Family Publishers, and even then, It was just his image. He did commercials for them, but his image was on the envelope that you got with their junk mail. He never gave out checks, giant or otherwise. But, that's one that's really strong for me. There are plenty more. For instance, there's one with Cinderella's Castle with Walt Disney. There's one involving the logo for Fruit of the Loom. But I'll let you look those up on your own if you're interested. But how it comes back to Mississippi pot roast is that I would swear, growing up, I ate this not frequently, but I remember eating this as a kid growing up, I thought. But truth be told, this recipe was created in the late 1990s by a lady named Robin Chapman in the state of Mississippi for her church cookbook. And so, granted, yes, it's been around for a quarter of a century now, and it had a bit of a revival during the pandemic, during the COVID times when we were all home and looking for something to do. And this was a recipe that got very popular and was online all over the place. But whether or not you ate it as a kid growing up or not, it is something you really want to eat now. So, without further ado, let's make a Mississippi pot roast. And as I said, in the length of time that I just spent talking, you could have this thing in the crock pot and on its way to being your dinner tonight. As always, don't worry about trying to capture the ingredients or the recipe in real time. It's going to be in the description of the video down below. Okay, let's get started. So to make Mississippi pot roast, the first ingredient you're going to need is, of course, a roast. You need about a 3 to 4 pound chuck roast. Next, you're going to need a 12-ounce jar of pepperoncini peppers. Now, I can hear some of you right now saying, I don't like spicy food, so this recipe is not for me. I promise you, absolutely, there is no heat to this at all. Oh, and by the way, do get the whole pepperoncini peppers, not the slices. We're going to take them out at some point, and it's really hard to get the slices back out. You're going to need a half a cup or a stick of unsalted butter. Trust me, you need unsalted if at all possible. You're going to need 1 packet of au jus gravy mix. You are also going to need 1 packet of buttermilk ranch dressing mix. If you happen to buy it in bulk, like I do, that equates to 2 tablespoons. And last but not least, for an optional step that I highly, highly recommend, you're going to need 2 tablespoons of a high smoke point oil, like canola, avocado, or what I'm using, grapeseed oil, for searing the roast. Okay, so our first step is the optional one. In a cast iron skillet, heat it up over medium-high heat, and once it's hot, add your 2 tablespoons of oil. Allow that to heat for 10 to 15 seconds, then add your roast. And you want to allow that to brown on both sides, a couple of minutes on each side at least, before adding it to the crock pot. It's just going to add some extra flavor to it, and for me, it's so easy, it's worth doing. Next, with your browned roast in the crock pot, you want to add your packet of au jus gravy mix, just sprinkle it over the top, and then add your packet or 2 tablespoons of ranch dressing mix. Next, you want to fork out half of your jar of pepperoncini peppers, about 7 to 10 peppers, doesn't need to be exact, and half of the jar of juice. To that, you're going to add your stick of butter. You don't have to cut it up, strictly speaking. I do. And then put the lid on and set your crock pot on low for 8 hours. Keep the lid on and don't open it and let that heat escape. After your 8 hours, you want to remove the pepperoncinis as best you can. You can certainly save those and eat them if you like pepperoncinis, but honestly, my experience has been that they don't have really any flavor left and they're kind of mushy. Once the peppers are out, take 2 forks, or bear claws as I've got, and roughly shred your roast. It will completely fall apart, so just normal forks will work. But ladies and gentlemen, that's all there is to it. It is really that simple. It serves really well with rice or mashed potatoes. I'm having some broccoli and stuffed mushrooms with mine, but you will not regret trying this. I hope you will, and as always, when you do, let us know how it goes down in the comments. All right, let's talk a little bit about A Cowboy's Gentle Touch. A Cowboy's Gentle Touch is the story of Lucas Clybourn, one of the family that lives on the Sweetview Ranch, and Ryland Solomon, the very quiet, very shy librarian in the town of Sweetwater. Lucas has had his eye on Ryland for a while, and the story opens with him trying to work up the courage to ask her out. This in and of itself is kind of unusual because Lucas is very outgoing. He's the most extroverted of all of the Clybourn kids. But for whatever reason, Ryland just trips him up. Well, he finally does work up the courage to ask her out. Things aren't necessarily going great in that regard when he learns that the ranch is in some financial difficulty. And he makes a rather radical and, one could argue, rash decision to do something that should single-handedly pull it out of that distress. But it's something that he figures out before it occurs that he's gonna regret, and he doesn't really know of a way out. Can this shy wallflower of a librarian flip the script and come to his rescue? Well, you're gonna have to come back this Friday to find out the full story. But for now, here is the opening scene from A Cowboy's Gentle Touch. I hope you enjoy it. Then come back this Friday for the full release here on Say With Jay. Lucas Clybourn took a deep breath as he put his hand on the library door and opened it. He'd been in the library 8 times since Christmas, and each time he'd intended to ask the librarian, Ryland Solomon, out on a date. Each time he chickened out. Today was going to be the day that he actually did what he had been planning to do and asked the woman out. It shouldn't be that hard. It's not like she was going to talk back to him or anything. After all, he wasn't sure he ever actually heard her say anything. At least, not to him. Other than, "May I see your library card, please?" Which, he had to admit, no one could say in a more sultry or romantic tone. It had given him goosebumps the whole way to his toes and back. Cold North Dakota wind blustered down the street, and he hunched his shoulders as he pushed the door open. The library opened 3 minutes ago. He'd been sitting in his truck for over 15 minutes waiting. He'd done the chores on the farm early, made sure the water was not frozen, and headed into town. He didn't want there to be any other patrons in the library when he asked Ryland out. He had a feeling she might turn him down. But the 8 trips he made in the last 2 weeks surely counted for something. After all, that proves that they had something in common, right? Hefting the heavy armful of books he intended to return, he set them on the cart and walked further in, past her desk. She stood at a display, her no-nonsense skirt falling below her knees. It was a librarian-colored navy blue, and the leggings she wore looked thick and heavy, as did her boots. They weren't heeled or stylish. They were flat and square, and they looked very warm. She had a bulky sweater on. It was another library dark color, and while it was not skin tight, it fell to her hips and emphasized the straightness of her slim figure. Her wavy hair, a dark brown color, fell to the middle of her back. She moved slightly, and his eyes caught on her fingers, long and slender and very adept at arranging the books on shelves. His heart started stuttering in his chest, and his feet slowed to almost a crawl, but she did not turn around. Ryland Solomon was not exactly known for her effusive, bubbly personality. That was him. Except around her, he got all tongue-tied and couldn't seem to think of a single thing to say at any time his eyes landed on her. It was like looking at her turned off the speaking part of his brain. It also made his throat dry, and his tongue wanted to stick to the roof of his mouth. Which was crazy, because he didn't have that reaction around anything. He was fearless, loved people, loved talking to anyone, loved being friends with everyone, and loved it when people loved him. Maybe that's what made Ryland so interesting to him, because typically he didn't have a problem getting people to smile at him, talk to him, chat about anything with him. He could talk about literally anything. Except with Ryland. He didn't really think it was the challenge that drew him to her. Maybe it was the fact that she was so opposite from him. He'd moseyed past her, and she hadn't lifted her head at all. It was like she knew it was him and didn't want to talk to him. Normally, he didn't have those kinds of thoughts. He didn't take anything personally and just assumed the best about people, automatically, without having to try to get himself to do it at all. It was just something he naturally did. He sighed, walking to the first tall shelf and moving around it, paying no attention to the books on it, and trying to think about how he could find an excuse he could use to go back and say something to her. She was a librarian. She could answer a question about a book. Of course. He grabbed a book from the shelf and walked back toward her, his steps slowing as he approached. She didn't lift her head to look at him at all. "Is this a book you would recommend?" He held up the book he grabbed from the shelf. She looked up at him and blinked. He didn't know how long she looked at him, but it felt like an eternity. Maybe a second or two, but still, that second or two dragged on and on and on. Finally, she looked down at the book in his hand and tilted her head a little, maybe so it wasn't quite upside down and she could read the title better. Without looking up, she began to speak. "The Complete History of Public Farting. Everything you want to know about passing gas in public." She looked up, and there wasn't a smidge of humor on her face. "There are some books in the library that I have not read. That is one of them." She waited maybe a breath longer, and then she turned back to her shelf. So, maybe it was the whole pride going before a fall, or maybe it was just because he was a total idiot. But he had just thought he could talk to anyone about anything, but he had since found out that there were subjects that he could not talk about with this serious and taciturn librarian. Public gas, its history and complete subject matter, was one of those things. He could not think of a single thing to say. He couldn't even get the words "thank you" out of his mouth. Time ticked on, and he felt extraordinarily uncomfortable. Did he go back to the shelf and pick up another book to ask her about? Or did he decide he was going to check this book out anyway? Every time he visited the library for the last 8 times, he'd gotten at least 8 books out. This would mess up his plan, and she might suspect that he was in here for something more than just picking up books. So, he cleared his throat. Miss Solomon, could you recommend a book for me? Man, he was such an idiot. If he was going to shove words out of his mouth, why didn't he say, Miss Solomon, would you go out on a date with me? Since that was the whole reason he was here. She finished shelving the book in her hands and then picked up another book, holding it in both hands and twisting it a bit, slowly and carefully, as though she were thinking. Typically, when someone asks me to recommend a book to them, I ask what their interests are. However, since the last 8 times that you have been here, you picked up books on rocks, the moon, alternative forms of psychology, competitive dog grooming, extreme ironing, and your fiction titles have included The Great Gatsby, The Iliad, Middlemarch, My Best Friend is a Werewolf, The Man Who Could Not Kill Enough Fungus, The Secret Life of Jeffrey Dahmer, and 50 Shades of Purple. He held up his hand. That last one was a mistake. She raised her brows, and he immediately closed his mouth, feeling like a teacher had reprimanded him in front of 30 other students and slapped his fingers. Given that there has been such a wide range of titles from you in less than 2 weeks, books which you could not possibly have read before you returned them, I have to say that I couldn't and don't have a clue where your interest might or might not lie. And the only recommendation that I could potentially give you would be from the psychology section, and specifically several books on bipolar disorder. Right. So he'd impressed her. He was pretty sure he impressed her. Would you like to go out on a date? So there, he got it out. So clunky and so unlike his typically suave deliveries. She was going to turn him down flat. He braced himself. She looked back up at him, her brows high, her face a honeyed mask of absolute disdain. The library is open late on Fridays and Saturdays. I would have to do it on a Monday. I'll pick you up at 6. My bedtime is at 8. I'll see you then. He thought maybe that was going to be the end of it, and he needed to hurry to go out so that he could do his fist pump and happy dance. Without her noticing, then she added, The psychology section is right over there. That's okay. I'll just take this one. He held up the book in his hand and started walking out the door. Just because I agreed to go on a date with you does not mean that you don't have to check that book out, sir. Oh, yes, ma'am. He turned around and stood at the desk. She arranged 2 more books before she left her display and went to stand behind her desk. You really ought to bring your library card, and then you can use the electronic scanner in order to check out your books. He almost said, but then I wouldn't get to talk to you. But he didn't. He didn't want to do anything that might jeopardize the fact that he had convinced her to go out with him. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.